the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. And today I am lucky enough to be with Nicole Tallman. Nicole, could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
Wow, well, it's great to be here with you today, Alison. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm a professional writer and a poet. I do some ghostwriting, and I do professional writing, and I write poetry, which is a very big passion of mine. And happy Poetry Month to you and to all of our listeners. My latest book is Something Kindred. It's out now from the Southern Collective Experience Press, and it's a book of grief poems in a nonlinear sense. So I think that would be what defines me in this current moment.
I'm going to jump right into grief poetry in a nonlinear fashion. I've been through grief. I think probably the majority of us have experienced it. And if you've experienced deep grief, you know it does not go linear whatsoever. I like to think of it as like scribbles. So when you draw like a whole bunch of circles on the page, that's what it looks like.
Yes, that's kind of where my mind is. So I'm sure you remember these older grief models, like the Kubler-Ross model, where it delineates these 5, and then it was updated to 7 stages of grief. And I lost my mother in 2017 to ovarian cancer, unfortunately. And the book that I have out now, Something Kindred, it is an exploration of that nonlinear grief process that I went through while I was dealing with the loss of her. But I also noticed during the pandemic that there was a lot of grief that was being had in sort of a communal sense. And so what I set out to do with this book is to give people permission to grieve on their own terms and not necessarily feel like they have to rush through it, and maybe to use poetry as a mechanism for helping to process some of this grief as well. So that was one of my goals with this particular book that I have out now.
Yeah, one of my favorite books. My first husband had passed away when he was 40. I was 37. So we had little kids, and there was a big process. And one of the books that got me through it was I'm Grieving As Fast as I Can, which I don't remember who wrote it. So I'm giving a shout out, but nonetheless, it sort of explained the way the outside world saw grief and then the way we experienced it. And it is that idea of like most people are like, okay, it's been a month, get over it. What's going on with you? And you're like, hey, it doesn't work like that on the inside. And it has been interesting with the past few years where the world changed in such a dramatic fashion that nobody had the language to really describe it well, except for maybe poets.
I agree with that. I think in general that writers tend to be very insular. And I think that people turn to poetry, especially during this time of this larger communal grief, as we lost our everyday reality. I don't really like to use the word normal because what's normal, right? But it definitely was a shift in what we were used to in terms of our everyday, and having to readapt and readjust to this completely different way of being and living. I think that a lot of people grieved throughout the pandemic, even if they didn't necessarily experience what we would consider to be traditional losses like death or divorce or something like that. There was so much loss as a result of the pandemic societally that this book actually, it's funny because it actually started as a kind of a COVID response book. I worked for the current mayor of Miami-Dade County, and I also worked for the previous mayor. And I had a lot of busy, long hours during the pandemic as I worked alongside the mayors to keep our community safe. And at night, when I would just have a little bit of time to myself, I would just sort of write and capture my thoughts. And I did write some grief pandemic poems. But as I started processing my loss of as it related to the pandemic, I started processing the loss of my mother in sort of a parallel path. It took me about 5 years to be able to write about her being gone. It was very difficult for me. I'm an only child, and I was very close to her, and it was just a very difficult loss for me. So I started writing that book in not 5 years. I'm sorry. It took me about actually 3 years. before I started putting pen to paper about what that loss was. And so I kind of went through this parallel path of processing that grief through this book. And it ended up turning into a much more of a mother loss book than a pandemic loss book. But I invite people to read it and to take from it whatever they want to take from it. And in the introductory letter to the book that I write, I actually invite people to write out their grief through poems, even if it's only one line a day. I don't know how you write, but we all have really busy lives. So sometimes I find myself just writing on my iPhone. One line at a time. You can make a poem pretty quickly, just one line at a time a day. And it's just something that's a little chunk and it's not too overwhelming. So I found myself writing a lot of my poems one line at a time on my iPhone. And I invite everyone else who's grieving to try such a thing. And if you want, you can even, send your poems to me at my Gmail account. It's NicoleTallman@gmail.com, and I'll read them. And I might not necessarily respond, but I'll definitely read it, and I'll send love and light to you as you're going through your grief journey, because I think it's nice for people to feel like they have someone that's listening to their words.
I found that I wrote my best poetry when I was in my deepest, darkest places. And when I feel myself slipping into those deep, dark places and I'm writing poetry on the page and I think, I need to do something else to get myself out of this deep, dark place. And it's actually hindered me in some ways from writing poetry because it's not a place that's comfortable to live, at least for me. Now, some people can look at the world and relate to that, and it's not always deep and dark. So maybe dark, some people, it's not the darkness, it's just that connection, the connection to the universe and to spirit and to nature and to human nature, philosophy. It's so interesting how poetry can come out of different people in different ways. And I really like the idea of one line at a time. If we can put together one line at a time, we can do it. It's to write a novel, they say 1 page at a time. I mean, if you write 1 page at a time, you'll be 350 pages into it at the end of the year. What a fantastic idea. Writing poetry, to sit down and feel like you've actually done a good job. And I'm going to take your expertise as the ambassador of the Miami-Dade County poet. How does that?
The poetry ambassador of Miami-Dade County.
Poetry ambassador of Miami-Dade. I mean, that's like a really impressive title.
Well, thank you. It was actually the mayor's idea. She came up with that one, so I can't take the credit. She's amazing. She's an amazing mayor. I love her so much. She's very service oriented and she has a soft, kind heart, and she lets people follow their passions. I mean, my full-time day job is I'm the director of legislative affairs for Miami-Dade County, which involves a lot of legislation and writing and things like that. But she also knew that I loved poetry. And she asked me last year if I would be interested in having more poetry as part of my job. And I jumped at that opportunity. I said, absolutely. And we've got some really exciting announcements coming up throughout the month that I can't get into details now because it's a little embargoed, but just keep an eye out because there are going to be some really cool things happening in Miami-Dade County on the poetry front this month and just throughout the year. I don't know if you saw this or not, but I do a lot of collaborative poetry as well. I see poetry as an act of service, but I also see it as a way of bridging and building community. So last summer, I got together 27 of my poet friends, and we wrote a collaborative heroic sonnet crown for the mayor and residents of Miami-Dade County. And we did it in poet pairs. Maureen Seaton, who's also a Florida Miami poet. She lives in Colorado now, but she's spent a considerable amount of time in Miami. And I would consider her a Miami poet and a very dear friend of mine. She and I put together this project and we wrote it in poet pairs. Back and forth, we sent lines to each other until we had the 14 lines of what are non-traditional sonnets. And we created this beautiful poetic chain throughout the community. We wrote our sonnet, and then we took the last line of ours and we passed it on to the next poet pair until we got to the 14th. And then Maureen and I used lines from the previous 14 sonnets to create a master sonnet. We're actually going to read that sonnet as part of the O Miami Festival, Poetry Festival. That festival kicks off tonight actually, but on Sunday we're going to do a reading for the community. It'll be the first time that the community gets to hear the Heroic Sonnet Crown reading. So anyone who's interested in that, it's the O Miami website, and it's going to be a beautiful reading for the community. And anyone who loves sonnets should tune in. And even if you don't love sonnets, I encourage you to tune in, because they're non-traditional sonnets, and some of them are kind of fun and light, and some are more serious too. It really speaks to the resilience of Miami-Dade County. You can see, we had that Surfside building collapse, unfortunately, back in June of last year. And one of the poems was written by these two amazing poets in the midst of that Surfside building collapse. So you can see this community kind of going together, bridging together through poetry, even in the most difficult times. And it was a really, really beautiful project. And I was so honored to be able to work on that and to be able to present it to the community.
I am just in love with this idea. I think it is very fun. What a great way to build community with writers.
Yeah, it really was. And my idea is that every summer I'm going to do a similar project, and we'll probably choose a different form for it. So the sonnet was obviously the first one, and we'll figure out what we're going to do next. I have some ideas. We'll see what the other poets say, because I try to make it communal if someone doesn't like the form that we choose. And it's also fun because I don't tend to write much in forms. Full disclosure, I had never written a sonnet before this project. And Maureen was the one who encouraged me to do it, because I write a lot of free verse. I'm more of a prose poet, I would say, than anything else. I have a journalism background, and so a lot of my writing is informed by my journalism and PR background. I tend to be, I would say, almost like kind of like just a very straightforward poet. What you see is what you get. But Maureen told me, it'll be fun. Come on, let's write a sonnet together. And I said, oh gosh, I don't know if I can do it. And she said, yes, you can. Just put your first line down on a piece of paper and send it to me. And I was so terrified, because she's this huge poet with 20 some books, and who am I, right? And I send her this line, and she writes back, and it was so supportive, and it was so fun to write with her. And I'm just so grateful for her, because she's such a generous, amazing person. And it's funny because I had met her as part of this Zoom workshop on collaborative poetry. It was her and Denise Duhamel, who's also another really big Miami poet. And they hosted this Zoom workshop with Neil de la Flor and some other local poets. And it was my first exposure to collaborative writing. And I just got, as Maureen says, she says, you were bitten by that bug. I just loved the energy, the way we were able to bounce poems off of each other line by line. It's such a beautiful, I encourage everyone to try it once. And sometimes it works well, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you're paired with someone and maybe you don't necessarily have the right energy, but I think that there's always something to gain out of it. Just writing collaboratively, and it really helps open up your mind and expand. People will throw surprises at you. It's like this wonderful surprise. Maybe you have this idea for a poem, right? You start out, and then the poet who responds to your line sends you something totally different from what you were anticipating for the trajectory of the poem. And you're like, wait, what? What is this? And then that sparks something in your mind. And it's sort of this back and forth conversation. I really love it. I think it's digestible, and people, especially if you approach it one line at a time. And Maureen and I are still collaborating. In fact, the last poem in my book, Something Kindred, it's called On Love. And it's an after poem after one of my favorite poets, Alex Dimitrov. He was the one who opened my eyes to this idea of writing one line at a time. And he has this poem. It continues to this day on Twitter. It's called A Poem Called Love. And you can follow him every day. He writes one line at a time and he tweets it out. The poem itself is in his book, which is called Love and Other Poems. So you can see an excerpt of it. But I decided to take that and do my own thing with it and make it basically my way of reclaiming what I love after the loss of my mother. So I wrote one line at a time. It just starts out that way. And it was a way for me to remember, this is what I love. This is why I'm here. There are still all of these things worth living for. And just to celebrate those one line at a time, it was a really, really beautiful way to process my grief.
I already mentioned I'm in love with the idea, and I'm still in love with the idea. And I'm in my head's going, wait a minute, when can I implement something similar to this? And how am I going to do it? And I have all these ideas now. I have, this, too many ideas. Now I need to focus them. We'll figure that out, right?
One line at a time.
Well, exactly. One line at a time, one idea at a time, one process at a time. I've taught literature for several years. And I would do this with my students with writing, it would be like so when I first began teaching, it was one of those 5-hour classes, once a week, 5-hour classes, you sort of run out of content at one point. And so I would have the students all get up and write a story on the whiteboard, one sentence at a time type of thing. It's kind of similar. I always felt like it was a little bit of a game of telephone tag, kind of like whatever the next word is, and then you just add it to it. But I think this is really cool. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I look forward to seeing how this really could take off.
I hope so. I really do. I want everyone to try it. I mean, it really isn't that difficult. Just start out with I love and fill in the blank and continue one day at a time, one line at a time. What do you love? There's got to be something you love, right? It can be simple. I love oranges. Okay, cool. You love oranges. And just remembering what you love and writing it one line at a time, you're going to have a poem. And maybe you take some lines out. I mean, there were some things that I wrote, and then once I put it together, it wasn't one of these things where I wrote the lines and then I didn't edit it all. I wrote it out and then I looked at it holistically and I rearranged some things. I noticed that sometimes I was repeating myself, or, maybe there were lines that paired together better. So I reorganized the content after I wrote it, but just try it one line at a time. I think most people have some sort of device, right? You can be walking down the street. Maybe you pass 7-Eleven. You're like, oh, I love Slurpees. Okay, great. There you go. Write it. I love Slurpees. That's your line. That's cool. That's something you love. If it makes you happy, it should be in your poem, I think. And poems don't have to be, in my opinion, necessary, like the words that people use in their poems. There's so much pressure to have like this certain vocabulary or this, this certain seriousness, I think, when we write poems. But poems can be fun and light too. They don't necessarily have to be, Oxford, or SAT, ACT word poems, right? You can just write simple poems. A poem doesn't have to be a complex form. It can be just as easy as I love oranges. Why isn't that a poem? Why isn't that a line in a poem? It absolutely can be. So I also want people to feel the pressure, not to feel the pressure to write to a certain, how do I put this diplomatically? Like at a certain,
You're a 10th grade English teacher. You're not writing for your 10th grade English teacher.
Right. You don't have to write like you have a PhD in literature. Not that there's anything wrong with having a PhD in literature, because that's an amazing accomplishment. But I don't think that PhDs in literature own poetry. I think poetry can be for everyone, and everyone should be able to write it and have their voices celebrated. And that's what I'm trying to do as well.
And I want to add that if you are a 10th grade English teacher and you happen to be listening to this, you are doing the work of so many people, and we need you. So thank you for what you are doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. English teachers are so important. I think my English teachers were so critical in my development as a poet. And just a writer in general, being just, I think one of the first people who said to me, wow, you can really, I'll never forget. I was 6 years old, and my first grade teacher asked us, her name was Mrs. Vaught, and she said, oh, we're all going to write little books. And so I decided to write a book about my trip to New Orleans. And I actually put together the cover with wallpaper. I don't know what possessed me to do that, but I still remember it to this day. And I wrote my story about the trip that I took the road trip I took with my parents to New Orleans. And I had my little drawings in there. And I'll never forget handing it to her and opening it and saying, wow, Nicole, you are a really good writer. And I don't know if she said that to all of the kids or not. Maybe she did, but it really made me feel good. And it's stuck in my memory all these years later. And I always remember that. And I think, thank you. And the same thing with my middle and high school teachers. They all encouraged me to write. My college professors. It's hearing people tell you that you have a gift for something, I think is very important. So I like to tell everybody, just write where you are, write where you can. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, and maybe it doesn't get published, but write it for yourself. It's a really good tool of expression.
Nicole, how can people get in touch with you?
So they can follow me on Twitter and Instagram. It's N.A. Tallman, like Nat Allman, N.A. Tallman. I'm also, my personal email, I'm not going to give out my county email because it's better for me to do personal. It's Nicole A. Tallman at gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook, but my page might not be public. It's kind of more for my family and friends. So I'd say Twitter and Instagram is the best way. And again, if you're writing a poem, you can send it to me and I'll read it. Nicole A. Tallman at gmail.com. And my website is NicoleTallman.com as well, my personal website.
Well, that is great information. And I know there's a lot of people out there that want to try their hand at poetry, but they're afraid. I think this is such a great way just to get started. But in the meanwhile, Nicole Tallman, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
I am. I love rapid fire questions. Let's do this.
All right. Would you rather use a microwave or an oven?
Oh my God. I'm embarrassed by my answer, microwave. Sorry, Mom.
Do you have a go-to snack?
Yes, baked chips.
And finally, what is the biggest surprise you've had in the last year?
Well, my book getting published was kind of a surprise. I would say it's that by far.
Well, that is an exciting surprise.
It sure was. Yeah, I thought I was going to be at it for a really long time. I got really lucky. I have to say thank you to Clifford Brooks, my publisher, for picking up my book. I am grateful, very grateful.
Well, Nicole Tallman, thank you so much for stopping by.
Well, it's such a pleasure to talk to you, and I really am going to look forward to seeing what you do with this one-line poem. And if you want me to read your work, I'm happy to take a look at it as well. I think it's going to be something special.
I'm going to make that promise to you, and I'm going to send you something, and we shall see where it goes.
I can't wait to see it. Thank you so much, Allison.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Allison out. Woo! We're all done.
That was cool. That was so fun. You're such a good interviewer. Some people make me like super nervous. You're like chill and laid back. I love it. You're really good at this. I see why you have your own podcast.
Well, thank you.
Nicole Tallman is a poetry ambassador for Miami-Dade County, associate editor for South Florida Poetry Journal, and interviews editor for the Blue Mountain Review. She is the author of Something Kindred, and her next book is forthcoming from Really Serious Literature. Find her on Twitter and Instagram at N.A. Tallman or on her website at NicoleTallman.com. For more information about the Florida Writers Association and about our upcoming Florida WriterCon 2022 coming this October, visit floridawriters.org. Until next time.